Hi, this is Dr. Sana Hashmi, and this week in my Print on China column, I discussed why this quiet release of the United States national security strategy has set off such a strong reaction on the Chinese internet. There are a number of commentators, analysts, scholars who are actually discussing what it means for the Indo Pacific and what are the security priorities for the United States. So in China, the document is largely being read as a revival of America First rhetoric. This is something that we have been seeing specifically since the President Donald Trump has come back to power. So this is not something new, but then this is, of course, a reaffirmation of what the United States is going to focus on now. So the Chinese commentators argue that Washington is stepping back from Indo Pacific security commitments and also from its alliance driven approaches. So it is going to focus less on that and more on the Western Hemisphere. That is something that is mentioned in the document. And then many see this NSS as a part of a broader recalibration of US global strategy, including a shift in its stance towards Russia. Many are seeing it as a cooling off approach towards Russia and the future military diplomatic priorities. So on Weibo, the microblogging website in China, discussion has converged on one theme. A lot of discussion has been under this hashtag that says that the US will never allow any other country to grow too powerful. And therefore, the NSS is being interpreted squarely through the lens of US China rivalry. So, number of Chinese scholars such as Tiao Taming and Chu Feng argue that the NSS continues Donald Trump's long-standing framework, placing US interest above all else, and also tying security policy more closely to domestic economic priorities. To them, this marks a return to unambiguous prioritization of American industrial as well as strategic advantage. And on China policy specifically, the document has drawn close scrutiny. Some analysts highlight a shift from the Biden administration framing of China as a long term rival to Trump's description of China as a near peer competitor. So, on the Chinese social media, this is being interpreted as a pragmatic attempt by Washington to rebalance economic ties as well as restore a sense of economic independence. But then there is also a lot of focus on the language used for China. So the use of China rather than the usual People's Republic of China or PRC is viewed by some as a subtle recognition of China as near equal status. So this is one of the indicators in term, according to a number of Chinese commentator and analysts. There is also debate over Washington's move away from terms such as decoupling and de-risking, and towards a language that is more centered on reciprocity and fairness. So basically, they are pointing and hinting towards the transactional approach that we are going to see more from the U.S. Policies and Trump administration. So the dominant view is that this is not goodwill, but it is an acceptance of the limits of prolonged confrontation with China and a shift towards more selective and targeted competition. Of course, there is some positive interpretation and there's some positive analysis of the NSS specifically with respect to China. But still, there is skepticism which still remains very strong with respect to how the US China relations and ties are going to go further. Renowned professor and analyst who's very influential, famous on Weibo and a number of Chinese social media websites, Chen Kanrong. He insists that China continues to sit at the core of US strategic thinking, regardless of how the NSS orders its list of threat, its list of interest, China would remain at the core of US foreign policy. But then a sharper line of commentary also argues that the document fuses economic and national security, casting decades of China US trade as structurally imbalanced. So in this reading, the NSS is, according to the Chinese commentators and in the Chinese narrative, is not a course correction, but it is a restructuring of the US approach, which they see as moving from competition to threat perception. Some even frame it as a modern corollary to Monroe Doctrine, which was also mentioned in the document, and also some of the media is now calling it as Donroe Doctrine, which is aimed at constraining China's economic and technological presence in Latin America. So, how they're comparing it as that Monroe Doctrine was actually focused on Europe, but now it is Donald Trump will be more focused on Chinese footprints in Latin America. So there's a lot of similarity between Monroe and now Donroe. So across Chinese discourse, this all points to one expectation that China US competition will become much more complex and much more complicated. So there is apart from that, there's also a recurring message around self reliance in China. There are a number of scholars, commentators who argue that whether or not the US labels China as a threat or as a near peer, that's totally irrelevant. What matters is sustained domestic development, self sufficiency, and self reliance, which should extend across defense technology and wider national strength. And as long as China continues to grow, the main argument across the Chinese internet platforms is that the Washington will be forced to acknowledge reality, but China has to grow sustainably. Then, apart from that, of course, Taiwan was also discussed and how the US approach is going to change, if at all it is going to change. So, there was this argument by scholar Chang Chiaotong, who noted that the US is combining toughness with caution. He sees Washington masking a defensive posture behind intensified deterrence and rallying allies to compensate for its own perceived isolation. So his conclusion is that China should reinforce strategic confidence, it should maintain long term focus, and then it should strengthen ties with neighbors. And also, at the same time, it should limit external interference. So they are urging China to have a more balanced approach, but remain caution towards the US and how the US approaches China. But a final thread runs through almost all commentary, and that is the more the US lean towards isolationism, the more unstable the global environment becomes. And this was put very succinctly by one paper post. And it was mentioned that the US has not only stepped back from being the world's policeman, but it has also accelerated global volatility. Now there's going to be more uncertainty, more volatility, and there's going to be a lot of unpredictability how US is going to approach the Indo-Pacific, China, its allies, its regional partners. So this volatility in Chinese view creates political as well as strategic space. Of course, there's always an opportunity in a crisis. So the NSS is therefore seen as a reformation of America First that intensifies doubts about the US reliability in both Europe and Asia, that of course would lead many European and Asian countries towards China. But that would also leave room for China to advance its own agenda. And there is this belief that despite whatever the US saying, the US China rivalry will continue to further, and this would remain one of the constants in the US foreign policy. So there is actually not going to be any relief for China. So this is one of the arguments that China has to be prepared no matter what the US says. Uh, so even though now there is this quiet uh, coming of the NSS, but despite that, there is nothing that is going to be changed with respect to the US foreign policy, US priorities. Uh, but it does leave a lot of vacuum that China intends to fill. And I think that in all likelihood, China is going to take up all the space that is being left behind by the US. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.